Well, summer's almost over. I guess it's been pretty good. Just been hanging out with my friends. Oh, we won our Little League championship. I was MVP. Don't mean to brag, but 57 home runs, only one strikeout. Every summer goes by faster. It's kind of depressing, but I guess I'm ready to go back. A lot of people have been giving me a hard time lately, saying I'm too big for t-ball, too big for kindergarten, pushing me to graduate. I almost did it once a few years back. I heard that first graders get to write in cursive. Sounded pretty cool. But in the end, I just couldn't do it. I have my iPhone anyway.
Johnny, what does CH say? Dog.
My kids are a little embarrassed that they're further along than I am.
Hey, girls!
But I figure when it's time to go to first grade, I'll know it. It'll be obvious. The heavens will part, a voice will thunder, "Johnny, it's time. You need to graduate kindergarten."
Johnny, it's time. You need to graduate kindergarten.
Not thundery enough.
1, 2, 3, go, go, Bulls!
If I graduate kindergarten, then I won't be eligible for t-ball. And I'm the man out here, a slugger, a star, and the only player on the team that hasn't had an accident in his baseball pants. Out there, who knows? I'm just not feeling it, you know? I don't feel called. I don't feel called to make myself uncomfortable. I don't feel called to no more summer breaks. I don't feel called to dad's pitch. Why have somebody throw a rock-hard baseball at me when I can hit it off of a tee? You know what I'm saying? Why do something that's hard when you can do something that's easy? I mean, we're undefeated. Why mess that up? It just doesn't make sense. But I guess some people don't get it. I guess some people just aren't smart enough to figure out how to stay comfortable, how to make life easy.
Safe! He was out! What do you mean he was safe? He was out. He was
It's
out.
kind of sad. I feel sorry for them.
Well, good morning. In case you haven't figured it out yet, we're going to be talking about faith today. Before we get into that, Ron, awesome job. He played that earlier this morning, and I thought, you know what, I need to return my guitar because it doesn't sound anything like his. Appreciate you playing that for us. It sounded absolutely wonderful. I'm going to invite the rest of you guys to get your Bibles out and turn to Genesis chapter 6. Genesis chapter 6. Last week, we kind of jumped in on this little series. We're going to be spending a few weeks here in the book of Genesis. We're going to be looking at chapters 6, 7, 8, and 9, and kind of doing a character study, if you will, of the life of Noah. And it's not simply a character study. We're trying to dig into what the world was like during his day. Last week, I kind of kicked off with a question that says, how on earth am I supposed to live a life of faith in a world that's so full of evil? Right? And we all understand that struggle, that pressure, and I talked about how for some of us, we're the only ones in our family who are saved, or you might be the only one in your workplace who knows Jesus Christ, and you know what it is, and it's difficult to live this life of faith, especially in light of the evil that's all around us, and we don't have to look very far to find the evil. And you turn on the news, it's there. You talk to any social worker, it's there. It's disgusting. And I don't know about you, but a lot of it angers me to see what's going on. And I'd like to think it's a righteous anger, but I probably fail in that area plenty of times. But the question is, and I struggled with this. I shared this with you last week. A few years back, I struggled with that reality. The Lord's calling me into ministry, and I look at what on earth is going on in the world around me. And it's like, Lord, how on earth am I supposed to make a difference in light of all this evil that's all around us? I came from a life of working in the trades, and the disgusting filth that's there, and trying to be salt and light amongst so many other unbelievers, and it's hard. And how do we do it when we're the only ones? We said, well, Noah. We're going to look at his life. Because if ever anybody understood what it's like to be the only person in a group of a bunch of unbelievers in a world full of evil, it was Noah. And I spent a lot of time last week getting you to understand to the extent of which the world was corrupted back in that day. There was a demonic invasion, and the sons of God came into the daughters of men, and the result was evil. So much evil that it's only evil continually. There's nothing but evil hearts and thoughts always. But there was Noah. And I spent a lot of time trying to help you understand where this evil comes from, because when you don't get it, we get distracted. Right? We look at the evil go around around us, and when it really gets hard, if you lose focus, and what I wanted you to see is all that evil was demonic influence, and it's still the same today. And if we're not careful, here's what's going to happen. Things are going to start going the way you don't want them to go. Or things are going to be difficult. And when you don't understand that this influence is demonic in nature, what we do as believers, and it happens not only in this church, but churches across the country, across the world, we get so twisted and so distorted we don't recognize the opposition for what it is. It's demonic influence. It's that attempt to come in and to create separation. And if we're not careful, here's what's going to happen. We start attacking one another. So-and-so said something I didn't like. He did or she did. They did something that we're not used to, or we didn't expect, or we didn't know. And a whole lot of believers spend a whole lot of time attacking one another. And they miss the reality of the fact of what we read in Ephesians 6 is, listen, our battle, our struggle is not against flesh and blood. Right? Our battle is against the evil one. But we spend so much time and so much energy pointing the finger at people around us, and so-and-so failed here, and they failed there, and they did this. And we spend so much time attacking one another. The devil just got to sit back and watch it go. So there's evil all around us, and how do we not only survive in this evil, how do we thrive? And today we're going to talk about faith. In fact, this whole thing's kind of about this faith, and I'm not talking about just simple faith. I'm talking about radical faith. If you're anything like me, I used to have faith, but my faith was T-ball faith. If you would have asked me if I believed in God, the answer is yes. If you would have asked me, do I believe in Jesus Christ, that He really lived, that He really walked this earth, that He really died on the cross, and that His death paid the penalties for my sins, and 3 days after His death, He rose again, I would say, yes, I believe all that stuff. I got faith that really happened. Oh, really? And do you believe that He ascended back up into heaven, and His current thing that He's doing is interceding for you and me and creating a home for us to enjoy sometime in the future? I'd say, yes. I have that faith. But listen, if that's all you have, that's T-ball faith. That's just enough to get by, right? There's a lot of believers, we have just enough faith to get us into heaven. But we never really experienced radical faith. That didn't happen for me for really quite some time, and I'm ashamed to say it. Because the reality is, it never went from my head to my heart. It never went from my head to actions. I think of when I started my business. Boy, it's tough when you're just getting going. And the bills are coming in, and people are slow to pay. And I don't know how many times I sat there and I wondered, how am I going to make payroll this week? And how am I going to pay that vendor this week? And I spent a lot of time worrying. I spent a lot of time developing my own plans and my own salvations, if you will. Saving myself from circumstance. And though I would have told you I believe God is big and He's bigger than my circumstance, my actions betrayed me, much like your actions betray you when the rubber really meets the road and your faith is put to the test. You'd say, oh yes, I believe in God, but your actions betray you when you spend all your time worrying. Or you can't forgive so-and-so, or you can't do this, or you can't step outside your comfort zone. Or you can't get aside from your own planning and your own processes. It wasn't until, into my 30s, I'd have to do the math to figure out exactly when did I really start to discover faith. When I got from that point to recognizing that God is calling me to go into ministry full time, and eventually that call led to going to school so I could get the training necessary to be a senior pastor of a local church. And even at that moment when I surrendered to that call, I said, okay, God, I'll go. I had enough faith to believe that He was calling me. And I would even tell you I had enough faith to believe that He's going to provide for every need, but you think I really acted that way? I didn't. I said, God, I'll go if. And God, I'll go when. And that when was if you sell my house, and when you sell my business, and when you sell my rentals. When I can collect all the money that's necessary, and when you provide a job in Springfield, and when you provide a house for me to live in when I get there, if and when you do this, then I will go. And if ever there was a time in my life where it felt like God picked up a 2x4 to smack me in the side of the head, it was at this time. Because I would have told you I had faith. And my wife and I, we got the same conviction at the same time, as if God audibly said, that's not faith. That's you making plans, and if it works out, then you will honor me or do me the privilege of doing what I'm asking you to do. And boy, did we struggle. But boy, it was at the start of a real faith journey. It got to the point where we're looking at the calendar, and nothing was selling, nothing was happening. God, it seemed like He said, this is what I want you to do, and He just kind of stepped back and said, good luck. And so we got to the point where, and this is what we did, I tell you, and some of you already know this. We looked at the calendar, and we knew when the fall semester started in Springfield, Missouri, and we circled a date on the calendar. It was 2 weeks before classes began. And we said, Lord, we're moving on this day regardless of anything else you decide to do for us. And I remember we're on our way to Springfield, Missouri. The house never sold, the business never sold, the rentals never sold. I mean, eventually they did, but at the time we moved, they didn't. And we have a 26-foot Penske, and we have my travel trailer, and I have a cargo work trailer, and I got a cargo van, and I've got a trail of cars, a convoy, headed to Springfield, Missouri, where I had no house and no job. Where are you going to go when you get there? I didn't know. My wife says, boy, what if we get there and it doesn't work? What, this is a huge fail. It's like, listen, we're doing this faith thing, right? And if we get there and it fails, there's something that God has for us in this. And I tell you what, God showed up and worked in ways I wish I had time to share with you about. Faith. Radical faith that says when God asks you to do something, when God tells you to do something, do it. And don't sit back and say, oh, that's uncomfortable, or no, it doesn't really seem to make much sense. This is where we jump into the life of Noah. And we see this man did not have T-ball faith. This man's faith is absolutely incredible. Now, there's some in the room today who are probably getting to that point in life where you say, well, you know, it's a little late for me to live out this life of faith. I've coasted into retirement and things are comfortable, and after all, what could God really do for me or through me at this point? For those of you who might be thinking, so at the time of the flood, Noah was 600 years old. No excuses. We're going to look at a life of radical faith. And now, mind you, I spent all last week setting this up where he's living in this time of incredible evil. And he is the only one. It's so evil that we jump in today with this resolution that God had come to in verse 13. So God said to Noah, I'm going to put an end to all people. Why? For the earth is filled with violence because of them. I'm surely going to destroy both them and the earth. The demonic influence, the demonic invasion had gotten so bad that there's Noah. It says, but Noah, and I spent some time showing you that verse last week, but Noah was the only one found righteous. And I don't know if that's to say Noah and his family. We know 8 people got on the ark, Noah, his wife, his 3 sons, and their wives. Or during this 120-year period of being a preacher of righteousness, if maybe his wife and his children got saved. And if that's the case, that's the only converts he had in 120 years. But those are the 8 that get on the boat. The world is just that evil. And I know that seems harsh. You know, a lot of people struggle with how could a God do this? Well, throughout the Bible, we see God basically acting in 2 ways. We see God, He's righteous, and by definition, He can't put up with evil indefinitely. So we see throughout the Bible that one, God judges sinners. It's inevitable. It's going to happen. It must happen for God to be a righteous and just God. But not only do we see that God judges sinners, the second thing we see is that God saves sinners. See, the only reason why we have the judgment to begin with is because you've screwed up and I've screwed up, and we've decided to take God out of the center things, right? This is what happened in the garden. Adam and Eve said, we don't need God. They bought into the lie of the devil. No. God just doesn't want you to really enjoy life. You don't need Him. And we've been living that lie ever since. So we invite the judgment on ourselves, but God in His grace and His mercy says, listen, judgment will come, but being a God of mercy, I will always provide a season or a time of grace. I will always give opportunity for you to recognize and to repent. And we see that throughout the Bible. Never is it a knee-jerk reaction. Even when God comes and says, listen, I'm going to destroy the world, Noah, but it's going to happen in 120 years. You've got time, and the people around you have time. And they chose to ignore it. So God says, surely I'm going to destroy both them and the earth. And if one thing is clear about the Bible and history, history is tending towards another time of judgment. We looked at it last week, Matthew chapter 24. In fact, Jesus says at the time of the next judgment's coming, right? The disciples wanted to know, what's the signs of the end of the times? And Jesus looked back to Genesis chapter 6, and he draws a parallel between the coming judgment and the evil and what Noah's role was in the midst of all of that. And it helps us understand what our role is in the midst of the evil world that we live in now. And between that time, he comes back to judge. So he tells Noah that these things are going to happen, that he is going to destroy. And so we go to verse 14. And he starts to give some instruction to Noah. He says, so make yourself an ark of cypress wood. Make rooms in it and coat it with pitch inside and out. This is how you are to build it. The ark is to be 300 cubits long, 50 cubits wide, and 30 cubits high. There's a lot going on here, and I can't unpack all of it, but here God shows up and says, listen, I want you to make an ark, and this is how I want you to do it. Now, this word ark, it's a unique word. In the Hebrew, it's teva. It doesn't mean boat as you and I would understand boat, and it doesn't mean boat as Noah would even understand boat. They knew what boats were. But this word teva, it's a word that means literally a box. He shows up to Noah and says, I want you to build a box. And then this is a unique word. It's only used 2 times throughout all the Bible. Actually, it's used 28 times. 26 times it's used in Genesis 6 through 9, all referring to the same vessel. The only other time it's used is in Exodus in regards to the ark that Moses' mom built for Moses before she set him in the Nile to go. Unique, incredible word. If you were to take the time in just a brief summary, right? Moses was put in the ark to save a nation. Noah was put in an ark to save the world, so to speak. Of course, God's working through it. But here's this unique box, we'll call it a boat, if you will, that God shows up and tells Noah to build. And this is not an ark like the size that Moses was put in. This thing is enormous. When you translate and interpret the cubits into feet, this vessel is 450 feet long, and it's 75 feet wide, and it's 45 feet tall. God knew that this was going to be a global event, and he knew that very specific instructions were going to be needed for Noah. I spent a lot of time, and I got a passion for studying in the area of apologetics and creation, evolution, and flood account. These are all big arguments within that circle of apologetics, and people all the time look at this and they say, well, you know what, it's not possible. And there's even some believers who would read this and they would say, well, I just can't buy it. This is more of an allegory. It's more of a metaphor of sorts. And they don't take it for literal. And you know what? I think the church is to blame for at least some of it. From the time we're knee-high to grasshoppers, what image are we given about the ark? Right? It's like this floating bathtub with the giraffe's head sticking out the windows and the rabbits sliding off the roof, and just this fun, playful little thing, and it's cute. But it wasn't supposed to be. It wasn't. I'm grateful for Ken Ham and the Creation Science Museum, who really got after building this thing to represent it for what it truly was. An absolutely enormous vessel. And you kind of see some people in the background there to give you an idea of the scale and the size of this thing. So big that nothing of this size had ever been built before or since until the 19th century. This was the Guinness Book World Record vessel up until the 19th century. It wasn't until the development and use of steel and iron were they able to make anything that was comparable to what you see. If you do all the math, and there's people who have done it, that vessel is equivalent to 1.5 million cubic feet. Somebody said it's the equivalent of 522 standard railroad boxcars. Absolutely enormous. If you went by today's standards, there would be enough room for all the animals that we are aware of in that ship with about half the deck space left over. And we'll talk about why that was necessary in just a moment. But why even point that out? We point that out because no human mind would ever think of doing something like this. It had never been seen. It had never been experienced. No person in their right mind would go out in the middle, and you get this picture of a desert. I don't think it was a desert, but he's in the middle of the land and builds a big box. And isn't it interesting that he builds it at a ratio that's 6-to-1 in length to width, and even today, the math in which boats and barges are built is 6-to-1 to 8-to-1 ratio. I mean, listen to me, nothing other, and it's maximum flotation and the square bottom, and people have done the math, and I don't do this. I love engineers who have these minds. Say literally that ark would have to be tipped on end for it to ever even capsize. How would Noah have any idea? How would human intellect be able to write this down and make it up? Listen to me, it's impossible. Divine inspiration. This is not a fable from years ago. This is an historic event. But he goes on and gives further instruction in verse 16. Make a roof for it, leaving below the roof an opening 1 cubit high all around. Put a door in the side of the ark and make lower and middle and upper decks. So more detail. And I don't know what translation you read from. Some translations say, I want you to make a window. And there have been some skeptics come along and say, a window would have never been enough. I actually like the NIV translation of this one. Because the Hebrew word that's used for window is not window like you and I understand a window. It's more like a skylight. It means literally, I want you to make a light. And he says, I want you to make it all around the ark, a cubit from the top of the roof. And now there's your ventilation. There's what's going to be necessary, right? This guy's getting ready to take a year cruise with a barnyard full of animals, right? You're going to need some fresh air. He says, you need a window, and I want you to put it all around, and it was unobstructed outside of the posts that were necessary to hold the roof up. So, again, divine instruction. I want you to put the door in the ark, and I want you to make the different decks. This is all going to be important, and you need to know this information. And what's incredible to me, up until this point, and we're going to see this throughout, up to now, there's been no mention of the flood, and for the first time this past week, I really got to reflecting and thinking on this passage. I wonder how much information God gave Noah at one time. I'm sitting there thinking, if God came to me and said, you know what, I need you to build a boat. Okay. I build a boat. Why? Don't worry about the why. All right, let's get to building a boat. The judgment's coming, but up until now, he has no idea. I mean, we know it's going to be a flood. He didn't know up to this point. Would too much information all at once be enough to say, oh, that's just too crazy? I'm not going there. I don't know. I mean, I'll leave it up to you to work within your mind what would help you out the most. I don't know what happened with Noah. I don't know if he got halfway through building this thing, and then we come to verse 17, where God says, I'm going to bring the flood waters. I'm going to bring flood waters on the earth to destroy all life under the heavens. Now, he knew a judgment was coming. And now God finally says it's going to be through these flood waters. And again, a unique word to this passage, used only here and one other time in Psalms when it's referring back to this event. Listen, they had words for floods and they had words for local and things of that nature. This is a unique word that's an absolute disastrous deluge of floodwaters and rain and catastrophic type environments that was going to be coming. He says, I'm going to bring floodwaters on the earth to destroy all life under the heavens. Every creature that has the breath of life in it, everything on earth will perish. Everything that's got the breath of life. Not everything has a breath of life. We know that, right? To this day, there's animals that live in the water. They were okay. There's plenty of water. But everything else that's got the breath of life is going to be done away with. It's going to perish, as well as everything on the earth. And I've had people ask me, and I've heard the argument throughout the years, do you really believe that? Do you really believe that God brought a global judgment of that nature? I mean, they try to argue for a local event. Listen, Noah's 600 years old. He's a pretty intelligent dude. He built the ark. I got to believe in God. I mean, he's given the instruction. If it was just going to be a local event, don't you think I would just tell a little move? Right? Just get your family and go to a different part of the country. No. And if you read it, there's a lot of great evidence. But for me, when people ask me, do you really believe it? I've got to say yes. And if you don't, you've got some serious problems on your hand. Namely, Matthew chapter 24, where Jesus looked back to this event. And he equated this flood and this judgment to the judgment that's going to be coming. And yes, it won't be a flood judgment that comes. But he draws a parallel between the two. Now, Jesus was very serious about making sure his people understood truth. And anytime they were believing a falsehood or a lie, he was quick to correct them. But Jesus himself looks back to Noah in the days of the flood and said, as that judgment was a global catastrophic event, so another one's going to be. Now, you tell me, you read about the judgments that are coming when Christ comes again. Is that a local event? Oh, sir. That is global. So here's Noah building a boat, and he's finally getting this news. And you look at that and say, wow, that's pretty devastating. And good thing there's verse 18, because there is a little bit of good news here. Verse 18 says, but I will establish my covenant with you, and you will enter the ark, you and your sons and your wife and your sons' wives with you. So yes, I'm bringing judgment, but here's my grace. I'm coming through, and I'm going to establish a covenant with you. And we're not going to get into the covenant today. We'll talk about that when we get to chapter 9. I said, I am going to make a promise that's going to help save you, and not only you, it's going to translate to generations to come. And my grace will prevail if you let it. And I like how he says, this is my covenant, because what it's telling us is this covenant, this promise that God is making, this is a unilateral covenant. This is not a bilateral covenant, right? The difference is, in a unilateral, there's a promisor, and it's only dependent on that one person. Bilateral, there's a promisor and a promisee, and he doesn't look at Noah and say, you must do, or you have to do, or you got to sign on the line, or you got to meet these requirements. He doesn't do any of that. In his grace, he says, I'm going to make provisions for anybody and everybody. And again, you'll understand that a little bit more when we get to it in chapter 9. And see, this is why I wonder if maybe there was a little bit of a break in the revelation of God to Noah as he's giving this instruction, because we see he gives some instruction. And then this little interlude where he says, now, as you're building this thing, this is what's going to happen. I'm bringing the flood. And then he gets back into some more instruction, come verse 19. And here in verse 19 it says, you are to bring into the ark 2 of all living creatures, male and female. Why? To keep them alive with you. 2 of every kind of bird, every kind of animal, and every kind of creature that moves along the ground will come to you to be kept alive. And this is where you'll get more skeptics who come along and say, well, now listen, this is impossible. How could one man possibly go around and get all the different millions and millions and millions of kinds of animals that are out there and get them to the boat? And listen, they're wild animals, and how would that happen? And not enough room. Well, you've got to listen to what it's saying. He says, I want you to go get 2 kind. Right? He doesn't use the word breed, and it's important to make that distinction. And one good example of that's that of dogs. Right? You have dog as a kind, but you got many different breeds of dogs. You got some dogs that are big and majestic. You got some that look like little rats, like what I've got, right? About this big, 7 pounds, a little bit smaller than some rats. You got to know my dog to appreciate that. But all you need is a Heinz 57 variety dog and get it on the ark and keep it alive. And then the breeds come as a result of environment and other biological changes along the way. But also it doesn't say, no, you've got to go get them. What's it say? They will come to you. Anybody here ever watched the movie Evan Almighty? No, Bruce Almighty. Evan Almighty. What's the one where the flood comes, right? And you got to build a boat. And the animals start following him. The animals just show up. Right? And God says, I'm going to take care of that. You don't have to go do it. And he's done it once before, hasn't he? Remember in the garden? He gave a project to Adam. So I want you to name all of them. And God brought all the animals. So this is not him going out to get millions and millions of different kinds or breeds. This is God bringing him what he needs. And he says, listen, I want you to just keep them alive. And part of keeping them alive, verse 21, you're to take every kind of food that is to be eaten and stored away as food for you and for them. He says, no, I'll bring them. You just keep them alive. Just feed them. And this is where it's important, right? Because there's two extremes. There's some people who say, well, you know, there's no way you could ever build a boat big enough to get all the animals on it. Well, as the people with the intelligence comes along and say, yeah, not only is it possible, but it's possible to get them all on there and have half the deck space left over. This is why it was important to have half the deck space left over. You had to take food. Why? Because God knew this wasn't going to be a weekend event. Right? This is not your 2 or 3 day, even a week-long cruise. This is a catastrophe, a flood that's going to last for 371 days. And Noah, you better get you enough food on that boat to keep yourselves and all these animals alive. Now keep in mind, up to this point, everything's vegetarian. Right? There were no meat eaters, and that's another argument some people use. Well, boy, all those meat eaters on the same boat, it would never work. Up until this time, they're all vegetarians. Nobody becomes carnivores until after the flood. And the only thing you ate was of the vegetable sort. And I don't know what that is. I imagine they ate things other than straw, hay, and alfalfa, or whatever you'd have for the animals. But he says, listen, you better get it all on there, and you're all going to need it. And all that to get us to this very important verse. And I almost just highlighted the entire thing. I didn't know what words to pick. Verse 22, it says, Noah did everything just as God commanded him. He did it all. And what's interesting is you read through this, Genesis chapter 6, Noah never says a word. Chapter 7, he never says a word. Chapter 8, he never says a word. Chapter 9, it's almost to the end of the chapter after the flood before we even see Noah open his mouth. Helping us understand that, listen, this is about God and his direction, not necessarily about Noah. But it's also reflective of the incredible faith that this man had to have. As you read through the story, it says, and so Noah did, and so Noah did, and so Noah did. You know what? I know a whole lot of believers that never get to the doing. We hear it, and we believe it, but we don't act on it. Here's Noah. No arguing, no questions, no resistance to some of the most ridiculous things he had ever heard. Right? No, he didn't say, you know, Lord, that project's just a little too big for me. I don't think I can do it. Right? He didn't argue the fact, well, listen, there's never been a boat built that big before. I'm not sure this is possible. None of that. No questions. No, why, God, I thought you were a God of love. Why all the hostility? Or better question, what's rain? Right? What's a flood? They never experienced any of that before. And why am I building this great big old box where there's no water? You don't see any of that. Listen to me, that's what you would do, and I know that because that's what I would do. We would feel compelled in that moment to inform God about some things he's not aware of, wouldn't we? Oh, Lord, you just don't know my situation here. You don't know, you don't understand how comfortable I am. You don't understand how hard that's going to be for me. I enjoy T-ball a little too much to go to first grade. And so what we see through the life of Noah in the midst of this world of evil that he's living in, not just faith, radical faith, is critically important to being able to not only survive, but to thrive in this world that we live in. A faith that says, God, I'm going to trust you no matter what. No resistance. No, I say, you know, Lord, that's great. Maybe next year. Or if he was me, why don't you show me a raindrop first, then I'll build it. Right? That was my argument. You sell my house first, and then I'll go. Let me know you're really in this thing, Lord. No. Radical Faith. Now, there's some people, and I've heard this argument, Noah didn't do any of that out of faith. He did it all out of fear. Listen, if God showed up and said that you were going to die in a great big old flood, you'd build a box too. And it would not be about a love for God. It would be about a love of self and self-preservation, that you would do all of these different things that Noah did. Well, you can make that argument if you want. But then you've got a serious problem when we come to Hebrews chapter 11. Because my Bible tells me by faith. By faith, Noah warned about things not yet seen. And holy fear built an ark to save his family. And that holy fear is not the fear that we're just talking about, where he's afraid for his life or afraid of dying. Holy fear, this reverent fear, is literally respect enough for God to believe whatever he tells him. And so Noah's perspective is, if God said it, I believe it. So out of holy fear, he built an ark to save his family. By his faith, he condemned the world and became the heir of the righteousness that is in keeping with the faith. And faith. And we learn that Noah was a man of faith. And what we recognize throughout the entire Bible, that this faith, it's the sign of a true believer. Right? A true believer is a believer who's marked by a life of obedience. And so, God, I'm going to do whatever you ask me to do. Yeah, but you don't know how evil the people around me are. No, I might not. Noah gets it. You don't understand my situation, and I might not. God does. And when he shows up and he gives you the instruction and the direction, and then some of you are going to sit there and tell me, but he doesn't give me the instruction. If you just show up, if I could just have my burning bush, listen to me. He has given you instruction. Start there. Start living out this life of faith that says, I'm going to do what God tells me to do. I'm going to trust him for the results. So getting back to that question this morning, do you have faith? Not just saving faith. Do you have radical faith? Faith that says, Lord, whatever you say. See, what was true for Noah is no different for you and me this morning. And that's not saying that we have to build a boat. Dispensations changed. That was necessary in that time, but Christ came, right? In the New Testament, we're told that Christ is the ark, right? There's our salvation. That's what's going to get us through the next judgment. But what about between now and then? Where's the life of obedience that the Bible calls for? You know, it is possible that following God, it might mean that we pursue some crazy big dreams. We pursue some crazy big things that might even seem impossible. And maybe we're even called to do things that others would consider crazy. I tell you, I had a lot of family think I was crazy for doing what I did. I shared that story this morning. There's a lot of heads nodding. A lot of believers still think I'm crazy for uprooting my family and going and doing. And maybe it is, unless that's what God wants you to do. And at that moment, it's not crazy. It's obedience. It's faith. And I'm not saying that you won't encounter moments of discouragement. I mean, just look back at the life of Noah, 120 years being a preacher of righteousness. Building this great big old boat, and I'm sure there's a time or two where he hit his thumb, or let's just take the fact he's preaching and there's no converts in 120 years. I mean, I can relate with that kind of discouragement. Ministry never goes, salvations are never as sufficient or as numerable as I would like to see. Things get discouraging. But by faith, he kept on going. And my encouragement to you this morning is, listen, this is a journey. This is a daily journey, right? Noah didn't go from deciding to build an ark to having an ark the next day. Well, listen, it starts with one piece of wood, right? He, in good faith, had to pick up the very first chunk of 2x4 or whatever it was that he used. And said, it's not a boat yet, but I'm going to work towards it. And I got no doubt this is going to work out good because God told me this is what's necessary. And so Noah, in faith, set out to do what seemed to be impossible. Because his faith was foundational. And as I think through that, I think, what is the application, right? Because we're not building a boat. That's not what we're called to do. How are we faithful in the instruction he has given us? There's a point of application for you to focus on for a few moments. Right? What do we read in his word? What are the things that he tells us to do? And for every one of us, it's going to be something different. And I jotted down just a couple quick ideas. And maybe your arc is something as simple as going to meet your neighbor. Your neighbor is on their way to hell. And they've lived there for as long as you've known. You don't even know their names. Maybe that's where God wants you to start. The one piece of wood, just walk across the street, knock on the door, introduce yourself. Maybe that's it for you. Maybe here's one maybe a little closer to home. This one's tough. Maybe you need to forgive somebody. Whoa, wait, now you're meddling, preacher. Time out. You don't understand what they did. Does it matter? This book tells us forgive. Can you forgive? Wow, that's tough. That's a little bit out of my comfort zone. I don't know how that might end for me. Well, you trust God or not? Right? Some of you, maybe you need to confront your addiction. I don't know what that is. Oh, that's just a little too much right there. You have any idea how long I've been struggling with my addiction? Listen, just pick up the first 2x4. Start with something. Some of you need to hang in there with some of your family members. Some of you need to hang in there with your boss at work and just understand, okay, we're riding out the storm here, and God's got me here for a reason. And that's not always true. Maybe some of you need to get away from that situation. Maybe some of you got to have enough courage to get up and leave the situation that you're in, but you're hesitant to do it because that's my source of income, or that's my source of security, or that's where I'm most comfortable. Listen, I get all the arguments. I really do. But for the believer that wants to thrive in this life, has got to get to a point of radical faith where we say it doesn't matter what God has asked us to do, we do it. And in good faith, trust that the storm is going to come, or that end result will be achieved. I invite you to stand with me as the team comes ahead to lead us in our last song. I don't know how the Spirit might be working in your heart this morning. I imagine a room this size, there's some folks here who've never taken the first step of faith and gotten into the ark, so to speak. You've never placed your faith in Jesus Christ. Listen to me, that's the only way to escape the judgment that's coming. And it's not my story, it's not my opinion, that's what the book tells us. And if you're struggling with that and you've got questions or you want to speak with me, I invite you to come and talk with me. For others here, you're believers and you've taken that first little step of faith, but you've really been struggling ever since and growing. Some of you are really struggling getting past the T-ball faith. And however the Lord's working on your heart, as we sing, I encourage you to just surrender. And whether that's coming and praying, or where you stand, or maybe with your spouse or your kids later on this afternoon, just be obedient to however the Spirit's leading you this morning. Sing with us. Father in heaven, till Christ returns or until you call me home, I pray that my life would be one that is filled with faith. Father, I pray it's a life filled with radical faith. And that's my prayer not only for myself, but for each individual standing in this room this morning. Father, that as believers, our lives would be marked by obedience to what you have asked and called us to do. It might not be build a big boat, but it's very difficult things all the same. So, Father, we thank you for the promise of strength and the promise of blessing. And I just pray that every day we would grow stronger in both. God, we love you. We thank you once again for this time together. Go with us as we part ways. We ask it in the name of Christ. Amen. Thanks for coming. You're dismissed.